Thank you very much for having me, and thank you to all the Davids, really, for putting on this conference and this center. It's a great honor to be here for me. It's my first travel of any kind since the before times, and it was all really a part of a incredibly detailed and well-considered, complex and ultimately foiled plan on my part that was going to end up with me being a regular contestant on Countdown. Despite that, I'm happy to be here. So I want to address the connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, or at least in my paper what I try to do is I try to map out the relationships between three concepts that we have in this discussion: anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and what's called criticism of Israel, which is really the latter is a really interesting concept too, because I don't think that phrase exists for the other countries. I mean, in German it's actually one word, right? And I've asked German-speaking friends, does that word exist within any other country in the name? And the answer is, of course, no. There isn't such a thing as, Frankreich-Kritik or something. I mean, it doesn't ring the same way. So the connections that I want to explore are not necessarily causative and certainly not evaluative, right? What I want to explore is an ideological overlap. And in particular, I think the conclusion I want to arrive at is that the connections between these things are not evaluative, but rather genealogical. That sounds like a lot. I'll explain what I mean in a second. But first, sort of to map out the notion that we have these three different concepts, the thing I relate it to in my paper is, just to give an idea, is the concepts of irony, sarcasm, and cynicism, right? So we don't go around saying, is irony sarcasm? It's not a really interesting question. It obviously isn't. We have two words because they're two really different concepts. But we can think of lots of things that are both ironic and sarcastic, sarcastic and cynical, all three, just one, none. Those words mean something, even if they occasionally overlap. And I think that's something that we can do with this. The really interesting one of those three, for the purposes of my paper at least, is anti-Zionism, because my argument is that anti-Zionism itself, or anti-Zionisms, as I'm going to argue, there's three of them, three clusters of it, merit their own study. It's not just that Zionism is interesting, and therefore the opposition to it is interesting, it's that anti-Zionism as an ideology, as a worldview, as an organizing principle of politics, is on its own interesting. And by the way, it is on its own something that we can render an ethical and moral judgment of, independent of its connection to anti-Semitism. When I first started working on this, I tended to name these clusters Jewish, Muslim, Arab, interchange, depending on the context, I would use a different word, and Christian. And I found that those labels were more confusing than they were helpful. And so in the paper, I avoid that, and I just give them Greek letters. This was, by the way, the paper, for the record, is before there was COVID, before people were naming variants with Greek letters. I was doing this way before. So I just called them alpha, beta, and gamma. I didn't get down to Omicron. So the alpha tradition is the one that we find within a Jewish intellectual tradition. An opposition to Zionism as a solution to the acute distress that the Jewish people faced in the 18th and 19th centuries. An opposition that was grounded in many things, by the way. It was sometimes grounded in theology, it was sometimes grounded in competing nationalisms, particularly of emancipated Jews. It was sometimes grounded in a global notion of socialism, or occasionally even communism. But more than anything, it was, regardless of where it was attached to ideologically, it was ontologically based in a commitment to the welfare of Jews, where this kind of anti-Zionism saw Zionism as not the solution. there's a lot of people who rely on the fact that there's a Jewish intellectual tradition of anti-Zionism, or that there was a Jewish intellectual tradition of anti-Zionism, as a kind of protective armor for an ideological approach that bears the same name, but is actually radically different. Now, a couple things to say about anti-Zionism, because we're going to ask ourselves these questions about AlphaAnticism, because we won't ask them about the other two, are, number one, connections to anti-Semitism, and number two, whether they have a relevant political program for today. Connection to anti-Semitism, yeah, there is some. There's also a lot of connection to anti-Semitism in Zionism, by the way. I mean, you can find anti-Semitic tropes and themes in both Jewish intellectual traditions, which is disconcerting, interesting, a topic for a separate discussion. Relevance to today? No. There isn't an active political program from the Alpha tradition of anti-Zionism. It ceases to become one after 1948. Once there is a Jewish state, this tradition of anti-Zionism, it's interesting to study. It's not an ideologically relevant program. The beta form of anti-Zionism is the opposition to the existence of a Jewish state in the Arab world. This is part of a larger political program in the awakening of Arab nationalism in the early and middle of the 20th century. It's part of, and certainly this comes and goes, it's an important factor in its early days that disappears somewhere in the middle of the 20th century and becomes really important from the late 1970s right up into our times today, which is the Islamic factor. And there is an element of it that is a rather direct importation of exactly the same kinds of post-imperial anti-Semitism that we experience in Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries. What do I mean by post-imperial here? I mean in the sense of most of Central and Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean world pre-1914 comprises these very cosmopolitan, multinational, multilinguistic, multi-confessional empires, and as these empires fall apart and disintegrate into nation states, various kinds of national and religious minorities find themselves in acute distress. But the Jewish distress on both sides of the Mediterranean is particularly difficult because nowhere are the Jews a local majority, right? So it's rough to be Bulgarian or Polish or Greek or Italian or whatever. It's really, really difficult to be Jewish in Central Eastern Europe or North Africa pre-48 because as these empires are falling apart, they have nowhere where they're a majority. And as these empires are falling apart, there is a surge in a very violent kind of anti-Semitism, which is sometimes grounded in liberationist nationalist ideology and sometimes grounded in other ideologies too, particularly communism and socialism. This Arab rejection of Israel is quite unlike any other multinational conflict that we see after the Second World War, right? This is why even the vocabulary of something like establishing diplomatic relations, normalization, which indicates something normal, is considered this massive concession. Because even saying the word Israel is not allowed for the first couple decades of its existence in the Middle East. Trading with someone who trades with Israel is not allowed. Having a regular border, having anything that looks like how states even manage conflicts with each other, to say nothing of friendly relations, doesn't exist. It goes down into trade, sporting competition, everything you can imagine. The rejection is total. And the imputation of a crime is not to a government, but to the people themselves. This is why you can get so much anger, by the way, sometimes at something like Israeli food. It's incredible to see how much resentment and hatred is sparked by labeling something an Israeli food, or by hearing the Hebrew language. This is why it's so easy to make up myths about all sorts of things that are actually pretty normal in the establishment of states, and particularly in the establishment of new states after 1945. This is why the violence of it is so extreme, both in theater of conflict and wherever there are diaspora communities, in a way that we're not used to seeing when there's flare-ups in other violent, in other international conflicts that have partisans in large diaspora communities in the West. The third cluster is the one that I call the Gamma cluster. This is the one that's really steeped in a very Christian theological worldview and that draws directly on very Christian concepts of Jews and their role in the world and in politics. What's interesting about and this is the one we're all interested in here because it's the one we're encountering all the time on campuses and in various intellectual settings. We said that the alpha form doesn't have an active political program, right? The beta form very much certainly does, right? It's the end of the existence of Israel. That could be accomplished either by a big military victory for a coalition of armies that are opposed to Israel, perhaps by some kind of diplomatic event, or any other way. Does the Gamma one have a political program? Is this an ideology that's calling for something? Is even the word ideology appropriate for this? Well, I'm arguing that it's not, because the Gamma anti-Zionism isn't about a political program. The Gamma anti-Zionism is an organizing principle for how the world works. It is a way of processing events and politics around us. An organizing principle that places the state of Israel, its supporters, at the center of global evil, as the summum malum of any kind of intersectional sin that you might imagine. And that makes anger at this always an expression of a grievance and never a pathology. The relationship of the Gamma form of anti-Zionism to the other two is also really interesting, because of course it borrows from the vocabulary of the Alpha form as a protective armor. But it derives its strength from both accepting the beta anti-Zionism while also denying what its nature and goals are. And so into this you get the whole vocabulary, the whole emotional and lexical toolkit of academic and intellectual anti-Zionism that we're familiar with. Just to give an example, the concept of washing, right? These Israelis are so bad that even when they seem to be doing something good, it's actually just proof of how bad they are. Now, when we say it that way, it sounds like a pathological mindset and it's easy to mock. And it is easy to mock, actually. But the fact that something that is so easy to mock and laugh at is the intellectual coin of the realm for some of the smartest people we have, probably on this campus and a few others around us, tells us something. So what does it tell us? I said earlier that I'm going to argue that this is genealogical, not evaluative, and several of you kind of furrowed your brows and looked at me and thought, what does he mean? And others were still picturing me on countdown. So what does it mean, right? I think a lot of the power of this debate about the connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is because people want the relationship to be evaluative from all sides of the argument, right? They want there to be a moral valence to whatever connection or disjunct we can establish here. So if I can show that my anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitic, it suddenly makes everything about it okay. And if I can prove that that other person's anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, they've lost the argument. They're illegitimate. And I think this is a waste of time. Because I think that this, in fact, all these forms of anti-Zionism are thick enough ideological constructs that they can be evaluated on their own terms. That anti-Zionism, and particularly this Gamma form of anti-Zionism, merits an assessment on its own terms. Its pathologies are evident on its own terms. But the genealogical aspect is important to the discussion because not because that's what's going to help me make a moral or ethical determination about it, but because I can't really begin to understand it once I've done that. unless I know a little bit about the history where it comes from. I cannot begin to understand why every single time there is a flare-up between Israel and either Gaza or southern Lebanon or in the West Bank, every single time, since as long as I've been an adult or a teenage reader of The Guardian, there's always a particular attention to how many children are killed. I can't understand that unless I know a little bit something about Anglican anti-Semitism and Little Saint Hugh. That when death tolls are reported in every other war, that isn't part of it. But it is whenever there's fighting in Gaza, southern Lebanon, or West Bank. That's not how I decide that that's right or wrong. It's just, I can't begin to understand any of these concepts, any of the way that we speak about Israel, Jewish community, people who are concerned about anti-Semitism, who, by the way, within this framework are always up to something and somehow opposed to anti-racism, without knowing that genealogy. And I think am I out of time? I'm out of time, so we'll leave it there. No, that's everything else just kind of gets up there. Okay.